We talk about all kinds of deer habitat improvements. Obviously, that's what this channel is about, and about strategic hunting. And what's interesting too, it's called Whitetail Habitat Solutions, but probably 60 to 70% of the videos have to do with hunting strategy. And that relates directly to the habitat, because if you're not building your property and your habitat for the deer on the property with advanced hunting strategy built in, then the majority of the time, in fact 90% of the time, those habitat improvements you are making are going to hurt you, because you're attracting deer to the wrong locations on your property, which means you can't access, and everyone knows, if you can't access your land properly, then you're going to spook deer. And if your habitat improvements are setting you up to spook deer because of your access and poor locations, then in 5 years, your efforts are going to be, you're going to experience a diminishing return. Your property is going to be worse, your deer herd worse, your hunting worse than when you began. So very critical. So that's why the relationship between high hunting skill and quality habitat improvements are linked together, that allow you to actually practice a high hunting skill, all go together. This topic right here, deer bedding area. Everyone thinks, well, creating deer bedding area on your land, on your private land that you have, but these same ingredients right here apply to public land. So this doesn't matter in almost all the concepts on this channel. In fact, I should be able to finish a book later this year. It involves my first 4 books. You take out all the private land stuff, and out of 74 chapters, I still have 49 chapters left that are purely public or private land, just involves deer hunting in general. This topic today involves deer hunting in general. If you're scouting for deer beds, if you're building deer beds on private land, it doesn't matter. It's the same thing. You still need to look for the same ingredients. There's no secret ingredients. Used to be in the past, someone touted 7 secret ingredients of a deer bed. It was a used car salesman trying to sell you something that's ridiculous. This is free. This is common knowledge. And number 1, should be very obvious and painfully obvious. Deer bedding areas need to take place in flat and dry areas. Now, everyone thinks, you have this nice little knoll, a bench. A bench is, I'll talk about these, and people will say, in the comments, what is a bench? When you have the side of a ridge coming down, and it flattens, and then continues down, this right here is a bench. Kind of imagine if there's a giant, and it's just sitting right on there, that you're sitting there with your back, you can put your legs over, that's a bench. And oftentimes deer bed on those benches, not high up. And these benches could be 80% of the way down, they could be 10% of the way down. It doesn't really matter. Bottom line is that it's a flat, and they'll relate to food and things like that. But it really, you have to have that flat and dry. And so I'll go to property and they'll say, well, I think deer bed down there, but it's a valley. And it comes down and there's a flat. Let's say it's 20, 30 feet across. Well, deer need to see out, but it has to be dry. And so a lot of these valleys become damp when it rains. So typically you find deer are not bedding in areas, with the exception of flooded timber that's seasonally flooded. It doesn't flood when you get a big rain. It takes something major for that timber to flood. Let's say, for example, snow melt in the spring. There's a lot of areas flooded down backwaters that get full of water because of that melting snow, but then they're gone 3 or 4 weeks later. That's a little bit different. But a lot of areas, they'll become damp just with a little rain. So you might have a flat spot, it might even be a firm spot, but they're not going to bed there if they can't bed there consistently. So consistent, flat and dry, rules out a lot of areas that otherwise would not be. So think about that. It might be where a point comes down, they bed on that flat. It just could be flat ground, and then there's a little bump up, and they'll bed there. They like visibility, they like being able to see and be able to see out. They don't want to bed in a hole. So think about all those types of things when it comes to that number 1 here. And I'm going to hold number 1 which is critical, down here below. Number 2, does then bucks. What do I mean by that? I talk about layered bedding. If you find a great stand of oaks, white oaks, in late September, early October out on public land in the north portion of the country, you might find great deer browsing, feeding, afternoon feeding all night. Well, then that closest adjacent quality, and it could be just adequate cover, it doesn't have to be high quality cover, is where does will bed, and then bucks will bed behind that. So there's people out looking for buck bedding areas, whether it's on private or public land, but even on public, where they're just scouring thousands of acres because they're looking for this certain ingredient that a buck needs for bedding, when really you'd have to start with food, then find doe bedding, and then find buck bedding. Signs for doe bedding, lots of different size tracks. It doesn't matter if there's a dew claw in that track. That has nothing to do whether it's a buck or a doe. at all. Could be a fawn running and those dew claws are down there and it's just splayed out. So try to address that myth in your head though. But you're looking for small tracks, big tracks, small beds, big beds, small pellets, big pellets. That's a doe family group area. Then go further back. What's the next adjacent cover away from that food? So you're getting further away from the food, where you find those single big beds, single big pellets, single large tracks, clean tracks. And when I talk clean track, you're talking about a track that I can take these 3 fingers and that track, and I'm a terrible artist, as many of you know, but you have that toe coming in like that, and you can fit those 3 fingers in right there, then that's going to be a large, typically a buck track. You know, there's always the exception to the rule. You could have some giant doe that has a big track, but it doesn't happen very often. Likewise, you could probably have some giant buck with a small track. Folks, it doesn't happen very often. The difference between does and bucks is a buck will mature in body size, skeletal shape till they're about 4, a doe about 2.5. So a buck keeps growing and growing. Skeletal size, you get a lot bigger. With that becomes a bigger footprint, and so you can take a look at that. But definitely, you find quality food for the timing of the season. Just because they're in a white cedar stand right now, towards the end of January, early February, does not mean that's where they will be in the fall. In fact, typically they are not. They're looking for winter cover right now. So find the appropriate type of cover, whether it's acorn related, apple related, food plot related, where they're going to be in October, November, December. Find that doe bedding and then find buck bedding after that. And it's pretty easy to find. Buck bedding will have a lot of obvious rubs around that area too. Number 3, direction doesn't matter. I'll talk about layered doe bedding, and someone made a comment the other day on YouTube, and I'm not picking on these comments. When someone makes a comment on YouTube, and I'll actually take the time, and on this one I did, because I try to answer questions on YouTube that are going to help the most people. If someone says, what would you do in a swampy area next to loblolly pine in Alabama in a flat? Well, that applies to such a specific, tiny segment of people. If I take the time to answer that, it doesn't help the most people. If I'm bored, if I have nothing to do and I'm just sitting there with comments, I might answer something like that. But for the most part, I'm trying to answer comments that help the most people. Direction, they said, yeah, there's layered bedding. What happens if the food is on the south side, the bedding goes to the north, but then we have north winds? And the thought is the does are bedding next to the food, the bucks are bedding downwind with a south wind. Meaning the food is on the south side. You see, you have food right here. Then you have bedding opportunity for does right here, and then you have bedding opportunities for bucks. North is up here. The winds go in this direction. So there's a common thought out there that does will bed right here, and then bucks will bed up here because they're downwind of the does. Couldn't be further from the truth. We see this consistently over and over and over again on public and private land, that a buck won't choose his bedding area based on the downwind proximity of those does. He bases it on the food's here. It's very stressful. Doe bedding next, very stressful. He doesn't want to be around all those does and fawns. So if there's enough room left over, I call that depth of cover, then those bucks will be there. The direction doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Don't think east, west, north, south. Doesn't really matter. Those bedding areas consistently hold bucks. Where I see it, where sometimes it matters, let's say this hoof print is actually a ridge system coming out, and you have winds blowing from this side and it's cold out, buck will bed here. If the winds are coming from this way, he'll bed right here. So that's the only thing. He wants to be downwind and protected, especially when it's very cold. Deer bed on south-facing slopes sometimes. If the wind is in their face, 20-25 mile an hour, and it's 10 degrees out, deer will not be bedding there no matter how bright the sun, because the amount of energy they lose by that 20-25 mile an hour wind, and it's 10-12 degrees, far exceeds being in the shade or not. You'll find a lot of sheds on south-facing slopes. It's because there's more food on south-facing slopes. Deer are generally there longer, linger, browse more on south-facing slopes. That doesn't mean they bed there in those locations. And it doesn't mean you shouldn't look for sheds on north-facing slopes, because if it was very windy and cold when they dropped it, they probably wouldn't have been on that south side except for feeding. So they are there a higher percentage of time, but they're still on those north-facing slopes bedding to get out of the wind often. So that's where I see direction matters a little bit, but within a given bedding area, there's usually plenty of opportunities for deer to get out of the wind on either side if it's a quality bedding area, especially if you're adhering to the number 1 bedding rule that we'll go over here in a second. Side cover. This is critical. Deer do not need a log in their bedding area to back up like a back of the couch. and sit there. They simply need to relate to side cover. I was with a client a couple days ago. I had 10 clients in 11 days down in Ohio. That was my first trip of 2022. My last trip of 2021 is always December. So I've already had 2 trips that I've gone to, 18 clients in those 2 trips. It was interesting. We were on a long points going down through open hardwoods, seemingly just wide open. But you start to get in those points, there's a few blowdowns, just a couple logs here and there. And you could see, without seeing any other beds, with knowing there's a lot of deer on the property, you could look at those logs and say, I bet you there's deer beds around there, because there's no other place a deer would bed. It was wide open, and sure enough, you get in there, we found 5 or 6 beds. Pretty easy to see. Nothing else like any other area there. There wasn't any more browse. It was just simply there's some logs on the ground. They relate to that. And no, they weren't bedded right up against it. And no, you shouldn't add logs to your bedding areas, because although the side cover matters, doesn't matter if it's regeneration, brush, a hillside, the topography change, conifer branches, blowdowns. I've been on a property, it was one last year we were in Wisconsin, northern Wisconsin. It was actually central Wisconsin, over by, above Holman, up in that area. And over by, what am I trying to think of the name that's up there? Dylan probably shoot a name, Arcadia, Arcadia, around that area. But there, we were in an open wood lot, a lot of deer in the area, but this open wood lot of about 30 acres didn't have a lot of tracks, didn't have a lot of sign. It was just too open that would have been February, March time, very, very windy, very cold. And there's one blowdown in there that was really in a nice spot for bedding of flat. We went around, there's probably 25, 30 beds. And it was only beds we found in that area. And they were just relating to that structure, no different than a Christmas tree on the bottom of a lake, rock pile on the bottom of a lake, and a drop off that fish relate to. They're just relating to that structure, and that's why they were bedding there in the first place. So that side cover matters so much. But what really matters the most out of everything, all of this, is regeneration and browse. So deer need to feed twice during the daylight hours, during their bedding hours. A third time, they feed 5 times in a 24-hour period. I say that all the time. And the first feeding is early morning. Second feeding is around lunchtime, late morning. And the third feeding is right before dark, usually an hour before dark on average with does. But they have to feed twice during the day. So if you have a great quality food source, but you don't have browse in your bedding areas, browse meaning briars, woody shrub tips, hardwood regeneration, various weebs, forbs, forages, even acorns. Acorns are part of browse. They're a complement to browse. They're not the food source themselves. Chestnut is not the food source itself, because it doesn't provide browse and food for the entire hunting season. Browse, hardwood regen, briars, woody shrub tips, weeds, forbs, forages, little bits of clover, whatever it might be, acorns, apples, chestnuts. They're all a part of browse back in a bedding area. Apples are a little bit more on the high quality side, even chestnuts. So I'd recommend that you're planting those back by your food plots. But you have to have that food value. So whether you call it browse including many different types of food, regen, briars, early successional growth, woody shrub tips, that's the most important feature. What's interesting about that is you have to have that food source, because if you don't, they won't be there. But you have to have that quality food source too. That quality food source on public land might be the acorns, might be the apple trees, might be a clear cut, but they still relate to the same. But also browse and side cover go hand in hand. So if you have high stem count, meaning stems, hardwood regeneration, when you get 7,000 shoots of aspen shooting up out of the lateral root system, that is browse, that's also side cover. That's why fawns are typically held in very brushy areas with lots of grasses, weeds, briars. That's fawn cover. It breaks apart scent molecules. They're used to that being security cover, not just down in an open hardwood flat. So often browse, regenerate, all this early successional growth equals side cover. It gives you room for does then bucks. If you have open cover, you're not going to have those does next to that food source no matter how quality it is. And you certainly won't have those bucks because they're probably pushed so far back out without cover that they can't relate to that food source on a daily basis. So you have to have the browse. Side cover is created by the browse and regen. Side cover sometimes the side of a hill, something like that. And then you'll have does bedding next to that food source, and then you'll have bucks. And of course, all of this right here typically what they're browsing on isn't underwater. So it's typically in a flat, dry area. So you can see how a lot of these work together right here. Direction doesn't matter. If you have great browse, it's adjacent to food, and then you have great browse and side cover adjacent to that browse, you probably have room for not only deer feeding, hitting that food consistently before dark in their third feeding of the day, but then you also have doe bedding opportunity and then buck bedding opportunity. This doesn't matter if you're on private or public land. Find good browse, good early successional growth, good food value, regen. Acorns are not, chestnuts are not, apples are not. That's just the icing on the cake. But if you find good browse, good regen in those areas that produce good side cover, then you have the opportunity for deer bedding, buck bedding if you find those layers adjacent to food. And it doesn't matter where you're at, public or private land. That is why browse, regen, side cover that it creates. You know, as we're talking about these and going through, I have a little red arrow up here to coffee. And you probably notice, Dylan doesn't zoom out to the table often on this, but I'm typically drinking coffee. It kind of keeps me amped up during these talks and everything and the discussions that we have for these videos. But we are developing our own coffee brand. And it's something that'll be drop shipped by a friend of mine that roasts, high quality roaster from many different countries. So we have a blend that we're developing for our brand, and then we have the coffee of the month flavor. We'll have that out pretty soon. It'll be shipped and roasted by our friend Dan out of the Western Michigan area. So we're looking forward to that. We're just narrowing down packaging and design, things like that. So look forward to that coming soon. We'll talk about it more in other videos, but we'll be proud to bring that to you. We're big coffee drinkers here. Dylan's got his mug right beside him with the coffee. Cheers. I think most of the time we were sitting talking, we always talk a little bit before we get started. This morning it was, want another pot of coffee? Dylan's like, yep. So he 2-hour drive here, whatever it is, drinking coffee all the way here, but we're drinking coffee all the time. If you guys are coffee lovers out there, look for our WHS branded coffee brand coming soon online on our site, and we'll share those links when we have it out. So we'll be excited to bring that to you. Folks, I want to make sure you check out my web class video series, whether it's how to design your food plot program or how to design your property in general. And we have a new one coming out that'll be how to hunt the rut. But these bucks back here are a testament. Some of these bucks go back to 93. They're even in different states. I urge you to check out those web classes so that you can help yourself, help your land, help your hunt. The link is in the description. And also for those that have tried them out, I encourage you to offer some feedback in the comments below. Thank you.